This is For the Love of Learning, Voices of the Alternative Education Movement. Be inspired by the voices of visionaries, changemakers, and ordinary, extraordinary people who do what they do all for the love of learning.
This is For the Love of Learning, Voices of the Alternative Education Movement. I'm Lainey Liberty.
And I'm Miro Siegel. I'm tonight's co-host, and this is episode number 125. This evening, we're going to be talking about creating learning communities and learning environments.
Simply, learning environments refer to the diverse physical locations, contexts, and cultures in which students learn. For a learning environment, such as an educational institution, it also includes such factors as operational characteristics of the instructors, group, community, and institution.
The philosophy or knowledge experienced by the student may also encompass a variety of learning cultures. Its presiding ethos and characteristics, how individuals interact, learning structures, and philosophies. For self-directed learners and those involved in alternative education, the definition of learning environments may be more fluid and open to interpretation. Tonight, we're going to explore the idea of creating learning environments, what works, and how to create the most effective environments that match the learner's needs.
We've got a lot to talk about, and we have an amazing diverse panel to explore these topics with. So we're going to jump right in. We're going to read each of our panelists' bios, but I want to remind our audience that you can find out more about each of our participants on the show notes page located at fortheloveoflearningshow.com, and look for the show notes page for episode number 125. There you will find more information about each of our panelists and links to their projects and websites.
Tonight's first guest is Shilpa. Shilpa is currently rooting herself in Oakland, Berkeley, California, where she serves as the executive director of YES. YES works with social change makers at the meeting point of internal, interpersonal, and systemic change, and aims to co-create thriving, just, and balanced ways of life for all. Prior to taking on this role, Shilpa spent 2 years as the education and outreach coordinator of Other Worlds, and 10 years as a learning activist with Shikshantar, the People's Institute for Rethinking Education and Development, based in Udaipur, India. Shilpa has researched and written numerous books and articles and facilitated hundreds of jams, workshops, and gatherings in over a dozen countries and on topics including creative expressions, ecology, new economics, and innovative learning and unlearning. She is also co-author of Connect, Inspire, Collaborate, a highly sought-after facilitation manual. Shilpa has been using tools like self-awareness, listening, appreciative inquiry, speaking from the heart, eye contact, breathing, and more to support individuals and communities in reclaiming their own healing powers. Welcome to tonight's panel, Shilpa.
Thank you. Thanks so much.
You're very, very welcome, and we're so excited to have you here. But next, I'd like to introduce you to Luke. Luke is a 16-year-old student and musician who currently attends an innovative public school in Melbourne, Australia. I think this is your second appearance on our show as well, Luke. Luke's primary passion has been music. He's been playing classical guitar at an early age, and more recently has begun singing and composing and performing his own music. He also teaches guitar and performs regularly with several independent ensembles. Luke has attended several schools around Australia and has had experiences of many different forms of schooling, like and including the public system, Steiner schools, and a parent-run community school. Luke appreciates the learning resources his current school offers, especially with regards to opportunities to engage in musical projects. However, he has also observed that mainstream education does not equip young people with the skills needed to thrive in a time of global environmental crisis and social polarization. Driven by this awareness, Luke, together with his parents, is exploring alternatives to attending school that create opportunities for passion-driven collaboration rather than individual achievement and standardized competition. So welcome to tonight's panel, Luke.
Thank you very much. It's great to be back on the show.
Next, we'd like to introduce Anthony. Anthony co-nurtures the community at Heartwood ALC. He's invested in a more partner-centered approach to facilitating learning and life skill building with children. He's deeply skilled at modeling the types of communication and conflict resolution skills that help self-directed young people build emotional intelligence and confident self-governance. Having come out of the conventional education with the gifted and talented labels and the A student mentality, it was in graduate school that he realized he no longer wanted to be a part of the problems he saw with education. He co-founded a school to work towards solutions and he brings a breadth of knowledge around the ways the structure of education threatens social justice for some socioeconomic classes, and how SDE works towards a solution to the issues that arise from that reality. Welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for inviting me. I'm glad to be here.
Of course.
Yeah, we're happy to have you. And next, we'd like to introduce Malika. When Malika moved to an affluent Philadelphia neighborhood so that she and her husband could get their daughters in the best school, she was shocked to face racism from the school's principal. Soon after, she set out to create the sort of academic, community-centered environment she wanted for her daughters instead of trying to fit them into the school's culture. Unschooling also created a platform to acknowledge and work for Malika's own liberation. School is not synonymous with learning, and when children are genuinely interested, the joys of learning unfold. Now Malika is extending her experiences and knowledge with families as an unconventional education advocate with a focus on Black-brown communities. Her work is providing support through resources and programs that empower, inspire, and create actions that impact families in positive long-term ways. Welcome to tonight's show, Malika.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here tonight.
You're very welcome.
Next, we'd like to introduce Dylan. Dylan grew up on the road, traveling through Southeast Asia and Latin America with his family. He's been a world schooler from a very young age, first leaving the country when his family relocated to Costa Rica when he was 6 years old.
Welcome, Dylan. And finally, we'd like to introduce Cassidy, who is also sitting right next to Dylan. Cassidy is a 19-year-old world schooler who grew up on a sailboat with her family. She likes rafting, backpacking, and medical sciences, and has assisted in international natural disaster relief efforts. Currently, Cassidy is completing her general education at college and will begin her full-time nursing program next year. So welcome, Cassidy. Welcome to the show.
I'm super excited to be here.
So what I love about this panel is it's an incredibly diverse panel, different educational backgrounds, and we've got 4 teenagers on the panel, my son, Luke, and Dylan and Cassidy, and everybody has approached education from a slightly different perspective. Cassidy, I want to start the conversation with you and ask you a little bit about learning on a sailboat and then moving into a university setting. What importance does learning environments, what importance did they play in your life?
Well, because I lived on a boat, that's what led me to pursuing an education in college. Before I worked in the relief efforts, I thought I wanted to be a flight attendant. Turned out that didn't work out too well for me, but through the experiences that I had on the boat and meeting the locals and understanding the passion that I had for the medical career, it drew me towards getting a degree in nursing. And I'm super excited to see where that takes me in life.
That's so awesome. And Dylan, we're going to actually jump to you next to, oh yeah. Of course, because you're sitting right next to Cassidy, but you two met in Peru. You guys met on a retreat in Peru, and the world itself became part of your background and part of the environment for learning for both of you. So the two of you had that in common when you met. Dylan, can you talk a little bit about what it's like to have an open environment as part of your learning environment?
Yeah, I think traveling around kind of really shows you how useful an open environment can be. And it kind of just opens up everyone's minds to all the different types of learning that there is. And you just kind of, you're able to choose what you want to do. I think it's a good way to do it.
Awesome. And I know we're going to hear a lot more from you guys. So thank you for opening up the show and sharing what your background is. I want to jump over to Anthony next. Anthony, I hope that's okay. Anthony, we had the opportunity to actually visit an ALC and have seen firsthand the type of philosophy for learning in action. I was wondering if you could talk about the ways that you build a learning environment and what you value for the school itself and what that looks like.
Yeah, sure. So our learning environment, is what's important to us is age mixing, and again, self-directed education. So for me personally, I don't ever want to be leading or facilitating an activity or conversation that is agonizing or painful for the young person or the person in general. It is much better and proactive and happier for everyone if they are motivated and interested in it. As far as creating a community, we definitely depend on just being our authentic selves as adults and facilitators, as well as the students. In bringing your authentic self, that means you bring your interests to the space, and thus other people are exposed to those things. So I guess briefly, it's all about making sure that we are a trusting, connected community, and everybody's able to bring who they are and share that deeply with other people.
That was a great answer, for sure. We'd like to go over to Malika next, actually. And I'd like to ask the question, in what way is a learning environment relevant to the learner from your experience?
Well, I mean, it's relevant. For me, it's all at the same time very relative. And that environment is going to most definitely depend on where the learner is at and what they're interested in connecting to at the time. So for me, creating that learning environment is wholeheartedly connected to whatever the interest is of the young person in that moment. So the learning environment could be your kitchen. The learning environment could be the park. The learning environment could be a fountain. It could be on the bus or a train. It could really happen anywhere. So for me, creating that perfect learning environment really connects to understanding how deeply I'm in tune with the young people that I'm connected to at the time.
And Malika, I want to ask you, in your mind, is there an age, well, just as Anthony talked about the lack of age segregation in the ALC
There being too much, lack of
age segregation in ALC schools, is there an age sort of segmentation to learning, or can the learners also be included, can you be included in a learner status?
Oh, learning there is no age limit. I truly believe that all of us can come together regardless of our age. I believe that if we truly have that interest and that passion to be able to share space together, we could all come away with something that's probably more valuable than if we were to sit in a space where we were segregated by age or by gender. For me, it really is about giving the opportunity for everyone who is involved to be able to indulge and take away an opportunity of learning regardless of where they are in their process. For me, learning is, it doesn't cut off at 17. It's forever.
I love that answer. And I want to make sure that a little bit later on we do talk about social justice as it relates to learning as well. But thank you also for that beautiful introduction. Let's jump on over to Shilpa. Shilpa, I'm so excited that you're on this panel because you are not dealing with traditional formal education in the manner in which most people are talking about traditional and formal education. You're talking about learners at all ages around all different sorts of things. Can you talk about what an optimal learning environment looks like for learners of such?
Sure. I mean, optimal, I think, as Malika and Anthony have shared also, that it's so much dependent on the person who's coming into them, and what optimal means to each person is going to be different. At the same time, there are like learnings that have happened, I think, about, one of the things I work a lot with is invitations. So people putting forth invitations that are really coming from their own heart and their own experience and their own questions and searching. And when those invitations are put out there with that genuine energy, then people respond to those invitations, I think, with the same, because they come from the heart, and so the response is also from the heart. And so that, I think, is the first sort of foundation for a healthy learning environment, is an invitation and a desire to come and be a part of whatever that experience is going to be. And then I think, like some really foundational things are around certain agreements and operating assumptions or operating working agreements for how that space is going to engage with each other, with people in the group. So, working on those agreements, which can include things like confidentiality and respect and really space for each and every person and their bodies and their whole selves. I think intentions also play a really big role in setting up really beautiful learning environments. So people being able to set their own intentions, which are different than expectations, not putting something on somebody else without necessarily having a conversation or some agreement around it, but rather setting forth, like, here's what I'm intending to do in this space, and then having that be shared and be visible for all of the people who are part of that environment. So I think there are things that are individual for sure in the learning environment, and then there are all the collective energies. And a lot of my work is around scaffolding that, like what is the scaffolding that really supports healthy collective learning environments, so people can learn together and engage together in profound ways that are meaningful to them. Just a little bit.
Awesome. Before I move on with some follow-up questions, because I do have several follow-up questions, everybody so far, I want to actually just jump to Luke first, but I do want everybody to keep in mind, the next thing that we're going to talk about is there a relationship between learning environment and perhaps compulsory nature of, say, schooling that most people equate with conventional education. But before we move on to that, because you've touched on that, Shilpa, let's move over to Luke first. Luke, talk a little bit about what a learning environment looks like from your perspective, and also as it relates to the creative exploration of, say, music.
Um, I think an optimal learning environment, like has already been discussed, has to be very flexible and sort of context dependent. But I think for me, the important things that are sort of the foundation of any learning environment are actually the relationship or the quality of the relationship between people in the environment. So, where it's not sort of a domination structure that there's someone delivering a lesson or where teaching is imposed on someone else. So where there's listening and the openness for mutual learning across age groups, across different skill sets, and also where trust is built. So before anything, any sort of journey or project is embarked upon, where trust is built through listening, and yeah, and then I think from there, sort of any direction is possible. For me personally, with music, certainly intentions. I really like that. That's really important, and not having sort of like external standards placed upon what you do, and it's easy to do that yourself. It's not necessarily something that is forced on you from outside. It's something you can do to yourself too. Yeah.
Thank you for that. It actually, it gives us a lot to think about in terms of defining actually what learning is. If we decide that learning is the definition that compulsory education uses, it's usually about being tested and evaluated on a set of knowledge that is deemed important to memorize or comprehend. But is that really what we're talking about here? And if we're talking about learning in a different context, then as a panel, do we feel it's important to define what that is before we talk about how it's possible to create an environment for that kind of, I mean, again, I'm going to say optimal learning, but as Shilpa pointed out, it's going to be optimal for the individual person who is the learner. Let me open this up to just creating a conversation. Is it possible to redefine learning different than what a conventional school or institution would deem as learning? Can we work on maybe a definition for what learning looks like first, so we know what we're talking about? Anybody want to jump in?
Well, I'll start off and say that um, I think the issue is that everybody will have their own definition and interpretation of what learning is. And so for any conversation, you basically have to come up with an operational definition and agree how are we going to define that word now, or instead of using the word, just use the action or the behavior in its place, because again, the game of semantics, you can play that forever. So if we're going to say learning is the acquisition of information, then we'll just say, oh, how are they acquiring information? Or if we're going to say, you know, the recall of that information, it's like, oh, are they able to just say, are they able to recall it? And so instead of even using the word learning, we would just have to get into describing that actual behavior or action, because, you know, everybody is going to bring in their own definitions for the word. So we might as well deal with exactly what we're talking about.
Yeah, I appreciate that a lot, Anthony. That makes a lot of sense to me. I think when I'm reflecting on what I'm talking about, it's a lot about people. I work in kind of three fields of transformation. So personal transformation, interpersonal transformation, and systemic transformation. And in all of those, there are different ways of growing, of connecting, of making meaning, of making sense. I mean, these are all different kinds of forms that are sometimes called learning, right? So On the personal level, it looks like for me, it looks like a person being able to understand more of their soul's calling. Why are they here? What is their contribution? What are their gifts? What are what inspires and helps them contribute to the world, to their communities. On the interpersonal level, it looks like how do I connect? How do I relate? How do I really authentically build relationships and bridges across social divides, race, class, gender, nationality, sexuality, religion, age, and so many other things that often are used as separating. What is my role in trying to connect? And that's a learning process of really being truthful and being open and listening and learning and receiving people. And then there's learning that happens in sort of the world of like, what is happening? What are these systems that are at play right now? And how do I make sense of them? And how are they affecting me? How are they affecting others? And how are they affecting people differently or similarly? And how do I also play a role in shaping those systems and contributing to making things different or making things the way that I want to see them, that feel more in alignment with my soul, with the world, with nature. So there's all of these layers of things that are happening. And I think, at least when I'm thinking about learning, I'm thinking about those kinds of forms of transformation and environments that support that, which to me, environment and community are inseparable in this. So it's both the space there, and it's also the people who are engaged in it, and also the wider forces, the forces of nature, forces of ancestors and spirit. They're all part of this learning community, which makes the environment what it can be for the people involved in it. So I appreciate that.
Yeah, and I think for us too, the type of education that we is less social learning and how the reflection from the inside out looks in terms of how teens, because we work with teens, how teens interact in the world, how to find their position and their place in the world in relation where they are, which is to me all about the same sort of reflection. And so for us, when we talk about environment, about community, that really is the crux of the social learning that we engage in.
And I would still very much consider that learning, because I think one of the main problems we face in the conversation around education is that people overly equate learning with knowledge and information rather than with experience, or rather than
Oops, looks like we lost our hosts. Yeah.
Nope. We're back. Sorry about that.
Sorry, connections aren't always so good. But again, and it's another learning environment. We're creating a learning environment by being here together in this space right now, having these conversations. I mean, in that sense, this also is a very valid learning environment as well. Luke, why don't you talk a little bit about what it looks like from the perspective of being in a Waldorf, from being in a public school, and then being in a community created school, which has been your experience?
Sure. Yeah. At the moment, I'm at a public school in Melbourne, Australia, but it's a bit different from most government schools in that the age levels are mixed, and all the subjects from year 7 to year 12, that's high school here, so we don't have a middle school, but all those subjects are basically open to anyone at the school. So yeah, it works with some very innovative concepts for a government school, but in delivering the state standardized education So the year 12 certificate, it still has to go along with all the standardized examinations and so forth. So yeah, I think what's made a learning environment good, in my experience, has been when I've had an open, trusting relationship with the person who is my teacher. And that's still the case at the school that I'm at the moment. I've got some really wonderful teachers and lots of people, staff and students, who come loving what they do with a lot of passion for what they do. But a lot of that often gets stifled by the fear and the stress that everyone is in to get things right, to get things done on time. And there's this constant feeling of, wow, we could go so much deeper into this. We could do so much more with this project or with this field. But we can't because we have to do this and this. And yeah, that to me is quite sad. So yeah.
Yeah, I'm listening to what everyone has been saying, and I wholeheartedly agree. It's been, I mean, Anthony and Shipla and Luke have all given such wonderful viewpoints on what learning is. And when I think about learning, when I think about a space where learning can happen, I'm also thinking about a space where you have the opportunity to fall. When I think about how learning is in kind of a standard space, the opportunity to fall or to voice is really stifled. And I think any learning environment for me is the beginning, especially Shipla, when you speak of the intention, when I think about Indigenous education, when I think about those spaces where everybody is in the same boat in that they're desiring to learn something more than what they did when they walked in, but that opportunity to try something new, even not knowing what it is, the idea that you don't have to learn in this linear fashion, that you can just pick up something new and try it, and you may not like it, and it's totally fine, but you're not going to be reprimanded for it. It's not going to go against some silly benchmark towards what you're supposed to do for that day. So for me, if I'm thinking about what a learning environment should look like, and like Anthony said, like we'd be here all day trying to figure out what to just define what that is. But if I were to pull back and think, all of us are from around the globe currently sharing space with each other, and we've all defined it in our own way, and we're clearly not okay with being compartmentalized in this idea of what learning is, which I think is what all brought us here today. So the idea that you can fail and that you can try, to me, is the most optimal, the beginning of creating an environment where thriving is possible.
I love that. And that your words are so incredibly inspiring, because to me, what you just said is it puts the onus back on the learner. It's like the accountability, the responsibility, and what Shilpa was talking about with the all in, with the idea that you're showing up. You're showing up. You're not being told to show up. You're showing up because you're stepping into the space of being the learner. But let me ask you this, and I'm going to ask this question to the whole panel. Is there ever a separation between living and learning? Can that be separated?
Absolutely not. In my experience, I'm not really sure what day I was living and not learning at the same time. I don't know when that moment has happened for me. Even the idea of thinking about doing nothing is still learning. There's even try that has to happen in that. So for me, the idea of living and not learning, or vice versa, just doesn't exist. I mean, everything we do, between figuring out a new way to get somewhere navigationally, or playing a new game, or figuring out how to cook something that you've been cooking for years and then you realize you just figured out a new way to do it. For me, that's all learning opportunities, and I'd much rather share in those than to look at these large so-called learning expectations that we're supposed to have. I mean, us even using this technology, there's always a learning curve, right? So we're figuring it out together. So I'd much rather claim this is learning, and this is something that I know that I'll remember so that I can apply it when moving forward. So not for me, no, there is no separation.
Yeah, I mean, I wholeheartedly agree with everything you just said, basically. I don't think I've ever experienced a moment where I wasn't learning from anything, really. Even just today, trying to set up this video, like you were saying, I had to download it and figure out how to use it. So I think even just sitting somewhere, listening to your own thoughts coming through, I feel like you're going to learn something, even if it's just some random thing that you don't really need to know. I think it's still something that you're going to be learning forever. I don't think there's really an end to it.
I think to add to that too is thinking about the previous question that we discussed is how do you define learning? What is learning? But in truth, what isn't learning? Learning is life, it's experiences, it's trial and error, it's moving forward past some roadblock that you need to work around. It's always an adventure, and it's something you can't avoid even if you wanted to, but that's the beauty of it.
Can I add a little something into this? I mean, I'm in general wholehearted agreement with everything that's been shared by everybody so far, and I want to also offer that one of the tools I work with a lot is something called zones of awareness and learning. And so in that, there's kind of this idea that each of us has 3 zones inside of us, and they're malleable and dynamic, and they change moment to moment and person to person. But the comfort zone, the space of, what I've learned, what I've already understood, where I'm comfortable, where things are known, and I can't learn more there because I've already learned in that zone. It's the things that are familiar to me, my habits, my proclivities. It's comfortable. It's comfortable. And if I want to learn something, you have to step into my stretch zone, which by definition is uncomfortable. It could be a little uncomfortable. It could be a lot uncomfortable. What defines that moment, though, is that I'm listening to myself, and I'm listening and speaking from my heart, and I'm listening to the environment around me and the people around me, and I'm really feeling where they are. I'm present to what's going on. I'm not in the future, anxious and worried about it. I'm not in the past, like repeating things. I'm right there in the moment, and I'm present, and that can be uncomfortable. And that's where a lot of the growth and the learning, I think, for me happens, and that I see happen in the world is like when I'm in that state of like, it's not quite familiar. It's not something I really understand. And I'm there. I'm present and willing to receive and to speak from my heart, speak my truth. And then there's the panic zone. And the panic zone is unfortunately what I see a lot also in our world too. There's comfort zone, there's stretch zone, and there's panic zone. And the panic zone is when I'm not listening, or when I'm not able to express from my heart, when I'm in my reaction. And my reaction could be a reaction from my amygdala. I'm in my fight or flight. It could be putting something down, putting someone down, not being able, attacking outward. I could be attacking myself inward, and then I'm not really learning. I'm attacking myself and putting myself down. Or I could be withdrawing from the situation, just cutting myself off, or I could be avoiding the situation, through any kind of distractions, which can sometimes also turn into addictions. And so there's also all of these things that are also coexisting, and I think they're part of our life. And I'm not always sure that there's learning happening in those spaces. In fact, I think there's likely not a lot of learning happening. It's a lot of reaction happening. And so I guess I just want to offer that too, that I feel like something that distinguishes learning for me is that in my life is that when I'm present to what I'm also experiencing, when I'm willing to ask questions, when I'm willing to also share what's in my heart and listen to others from my heart too. And that's not always present at every moment for myself or for maybe everyone in different moments. And so I just want to open that up, that there are things that also stand in the way of taking all of the learning that is there in life at every moment. And so I want to name that and say that those are also not fixed states or permanent states. They're evolving and transformative, but transformable, but they're also there. So I just wanted to name that.
Yeah, and it's interesting because these are concepts that we work with as well when we're working with teens, and whether it's an active learning, it's all part of the big picture of learning. And it occurs to me as I'm listening to you, Shilpa, speak, is that the process of learning itself, there's never a break between being the learner and being in a learning environment. Like there's never that break. It's fluid to different degrees of what's more dominant, but it's a wonderful reflection. I love how you've articulated the concept. It's wonderful. Thank you for sharing that. Does anybody else want to talk about the roles that you play as maybe a facilitator and a learner, and how those roles oscillate for you?
I'll go ahead and say that here at Heartwood, being a facilitator, is really just about being, the adult in the space, the more experienced person in the space, and knowing, having that experience, knowing how to get a young person from point A to point B, and showing them how to be able to figure that out by themselves and on their own. But then in order for them to really get that, I have to model it. And so I'm concurrently facilitating for them, but also doing my own learning and living and trying things out. And they see me trying things and failing and trying things and failing over and over again, but just sort of experimenting the process and eventually getting it. And that's what modeling is. That's what we as adults are, I believe, tasked to do when we are engaging with and interacting with or facilitating young people.
I'd actually really like to pose a question to the whole panel. So I feel that when people talk about learning environments, more often than not, they're talking about literal surroundings, or they're talking about what is physically around. But I would like to talk more, maybe in a sense, this is more about the social aspect of it, but I want to ask the panel, in what ways do you think culture is really important to learning environments and learning communities? And I'm not necessarily just talking about, people's cultures. I'm also talking about the culture within a learning community, like the community culture or the class culture or just whatever. But how do you think other people's cultures and other people's ways of being might influence your learning, especially in a social environment?
So at Agile Learning Centers, there's one of our roots or tenets is the medium is the message, that people learn more from the culture than from the instruction. Here at Heartwood, and I believe at other AOCs, there's a huge focus, if not a priority, on the culture of that school and that community, the ways that everybody speaks to each other, the ways we behave with each other, the ways we do things, our customs and traditions. You learn so much more from that and how to treat people and how to live in community with people. That's the big mission in life, is existing with other people and getting along. And so that's so much bigger than me sitting down and helping you through a math textbook or throwing out some history facts at you. I believe that culture is the main avenue for any kind of instruction, and that means relationship. That means trusting the other person. That means the ways we speak to each other. Are we kind of sarcastic and nasty? Are we nice and polite? Are we helpful? What do we do when somebody gets hurt? Do we stay around? Do we get an adult, or are we empowered to go get the first aid kit and the ice pack ourselves? So I think all of those things, you figure much more about life than us sitting down and, going over it. Like the textbook stuff helps, book knowledge and book work, workbooks and videos, that all is great and beneficial, but we can't underestimate and undervalue how much the relationship matters.
If I can, I love that, Anthony. Thank you so much for sharing that, because I mean it's so real. I mean, for me, with my business of Eclectic Learning Network, culture is literally a part of my mission statement. Everything that I am doing is about the empowerment and the enrichment and support of the family's culture and their cultural and interest-driven needs. Because if we're not bringing those two together, I mean, all we're left with really are just textbooks. I mean, if we're not going to introduce that culture of who we are as individuals and share in that space, I feel like I'm just going back to school with that same idea. And when I'm a person who went to public school, and culture in many times was not a part of our day. Yes, class culture was, but then there's always going to be a certain type of influence that's there, and it's going to sway you one way or the other. But for me personally, I want to take that deeper. I want to see what all of the people around us are doing and being able to share in space and see what happens when, for instance, I'll use bread as an example. I love food, first of all. I'm a huge foodie. And one of the ways that my personal children learn is through food. And bread is something that crosses all cultures. And we will learn how to make all these different types of breads that represent different types of cultures from around the world. So when we can not only just identify our differences, but also look at our similarities between roti or naan, and really just dig in and see what that means. But for me and my business and my children, culture is the number one focus of what we do and how we connect with other people within the community and beyond.
Can I add a little something here too? One of my friends, he talks about culture as structures, skill sets, and mindsets. And so when I started to hear that, I was like, oh, wow, like every place has a culture. There's certain structures in place. There are certain skill sets that are being used, and there are certain mindsets that are operational here. And so I could say, like in traditional schooling, the structures are like, classroom rows and a teacher in the front, and that there's certain skill sets of like sitting quietly and being able to take a test, and the mindset is a lot around competition and individualism. For example, that might be one way I could describe it. In some of my work in India, we wrote about something called resisting the culture of schooling and tried to delineate some of those aspects of it, the fear and the obedience and the hierarchies and so on, and the separation of self. So we tried to delineate and describe some of that in that work. And then I've been thinking a lot about like the kinds of learning environments I'm excited about building, and what are those structures, and what do they look like, and what are those skill sets, and what are those mindsets. And a lot of that has to do for me around like looking at what does it mean to have circles? What does it mean to have one-on-one conversations? What does it mean to engage like structures like that, or structures that allow and enable flow and space of time and movement and certain agreements? And those are structures. And then there's skill sets that we're using of deep listening, skill sets of speaking from the heart, speaking from the eye, skill sets of asking appreciative questions. Those are skill sets that can be learned and practiced and built. And they feed and they connect with the structures. So if there's structures to support those skill sets, then they get stronger. And then there are mindsets. There are mindsets of generosity. There's mindsets of love and of collaboration. And those are also like, they're all interplaying together. And so I'm definitely with Anthony and Malika here, where like culture is at the heart of everything, and culture is the heart of the environment. I love the question that you're asking, because it's also about the physical space too. The kinds of physical spaces we're inhabiting have influence on us. They affect our bodies. They affect how each one of us can show up. And so it is physical space. It is social space. It is spiritual space. It is emotional space. Like all of those things are collaborating together, interplaying together. And the culture is kind of the the confluence of all of that. It's bringing those pieces together. And so to me, those are like infinite entry points, like so many places where maybe there isn't that kind of environment being set up, but there's so many entry points where maybe some slight shifts here and there can really shift big things in the culture and what is possible there. And I've done some experiments in like banks and working with like clients in different places where just like flipping things around, having people play a game, trying something on again in that stretch zone in that learning space, that we're flipping things of the existing structures, skill sets, and mindsets that actually transform the culture. So just wanted to throw that in. That there's a lot of entry points there. Lainey, was that a question to me or was that to the whole panel? Sorry, it wasn't clear to me.
I'm sorry, our connection's not the best right now. It was to the panel, but I was responding to something that you had said before, so I would love to hear from. The question is, I'm so sorry. The question is, as learners, what is our responsibility? What are we accountable for bringing to the mix in terms of what we need to be a learner? Some people say we are vessels that are empty that need to be filled with education. That's one concept of approaching education, not one that I personally agree with. But what is our responsibility as a learner? What do we bring to the mix?
For me, that's a huge, huge question. Accountability comes up a lot, either as a learner and as a facilitator, or in my world, I just consider it a guide. But the first word that comes to mind is openness. There has to be an openness for me as a learner and as a guide. And sometimes as a guide, sometimes it's really challenging, especially when you're working with young people. And I know for myself, there was so much of deconditioning that I had to do of my own to even engage these spaces, that the idea of being open to really hearing someone or listening to someone in a way that goes beyond my own conditioning is a challenge in itself. But the idea of learning is to be open to the idea that you are going to be introduced to something beyond what you intended on finding, or maybe not. The idea that you can just sit and be about. It's such a strong question for me, but accountability, I think the biggest accountability is the accountability that you have to oneself to be your best or be your worst whenever that falls. But I don't know if I cannot press upon my children to fully I can't make them be accountable. They have to choose that for themselves. And I think that really comes down to them making the decision of what they're going to commit to on their own. If they're taking a silly test here in PA, homeschoolers have to take standardized tests. I'm anti-test, but they take them. And if they don't do well, whatever that means, they know that for them, they have to decide what that feels like for them. It's not about what the test says, but what their comfort level was when they received those results. So there has to be an openness for them to examine that, to dig deeper and say, is it worth it to me, or is it worth it because this space dictates that it should be? So openness and accountability, if they can be open enough, then the accountability will come, in my opinion.
I think that was a great point about openness. I love the idea of being open-minded as a learner. It's been such a huge concept to me, and it's helped me grow within the past forever. It really allows you to take into account all the cards that are on the table, and whether or not you accept certain things, at least consider them. And then weed out the ideas that you don't like. And really, it's helped me narrow down a lot of the person that I want to be when I grow up and as I continue to grow up. And it allows you to see every possibility for the future. And I think my background of unschooling and world schooling, homeschooling, public schooling, all of it has really given me that opportunity to take advantage of everything that the world has to offer.
I also really love the idea of openness. That was the first word that came to my head. But I think also, if we ask what am I accountable for as a learner or as someone in the learning space, which makes me a learner, I think that we're accountable for that which we bring into the space, because the space is something that we create. Everyone who's in it has an impact on what kind of environment that's going to be. So as soon as I feel like as soon as something's imposed or forced upon someone else, they lose their ability to be open. So, I mean, there's nothing wrong with, asking for something that you really want or pushing for something that you're excited about. But when it's about forcing something on someone else, you sort of destroy their ability to be open and really go with it wholeheartedly. So yeah, as well as openness, the ability to listen. I mean, I said that before, but yeah, I think listening, putting attention to listening to each other is really key. Thinking as a learning environment as something that we engage with daily, but also thinking of it as something that never stops, not just acquiring new skills, but dealing with crises and resolving conflicts. It's all about being able to listen and hear what's needed without having to rush to imposing a solution without actually having heard what's really going on.
I think coming at it from the learner's perspective, I think one of the most important things, and it's almost like the learner's obligation, is that the most important thing that we can bring to the table and bring to the conversation is questions. We have to bring our questions and our curiosity and our interests and our engagement to the conversation, because I think that from a learner's perspective, and especially if you're learning in community, if it's a social learning environment, I think every question is in itself perhaps a catalyst for discovery, for realization, and not just for you, but for people who are also thinking about the questions and are also hearing them and starting to contemplate them. And so I think that basically being able to question everything that comes up in your learning journey is one of the greatest things that we can do. Just look for different perspectives, look for different answers to the same stories, look for different tellings of the story, look for, different possibilities, and just ask those questions, ask those what if questions, ask whatever. I don't know, I think it's important.
I think it is too. And I think having conversations like this with panel, we're remembering that learning is active. It's not a passive activity that I was once told and trained through my public education schooling experience. I had to relearn that as well. So I think the more that we continue to have these conversations, it does put the accountability and the power back into the place of the learner, which is beautiful. So we've been going for an hour, and we're going to take a really short break, and we're going to watch a video, and we'll be back in just a few minutes. So stay tuned, and we'll be back after this.
So the first condition is a clear understanding that education is the child's responsibility. When children know that they're responsible for their education, they take that responsibility. When they believe, they're led to believe that somebody else is responsible for their education and all they have to do is do what they're told, then they tend to do that in the minimal way and they don't take responsibility for their education. Second condition, unlimited opportunity to play, explore, and pursue your own interests. Unlimited time, not an hour a day, not 2 hours a day, unlimited time. It takes time to try out different things. It takes time to get bored, to overcome boredom. You can't interrupt that with bells and telling people constantly what to do and expect people to really develop a passion. 3, opportunity to play with the tools of the culture, to really play with the tools of the culture. In a hunter-gatherer culture, those would be bows and arrows and knives and fire and digging sticks. In our culture, of course, the main tool is a computer. And it's not surprising that children everywhere in our culture love to play with computers. They know in their bones that this is the tool of the culture, and they need to spend a lot of time with it. So it becomes, in a sense, an extension of their own body. Access to a variety of caring adults who are helpers, not judges. How important that last part is. Helpers, not judges. The last person you want to go to help you learn something is somebody who's evaluating you. You're nervous about that person. That person is a person you go to in the frame of mind of trying to impress that person with how much you know, not to say, I really don't know this and I would like some help. Free age mixing among children and adolescents are absolutely key to the school. The school would not work if it were children all the same age, because children don't have much to learn from others who are the same age. They learn from children who are older and from children who are younger than themselves. 6, immersion in a stable, moral, democratic community. Communities in which every child knows that their ideas and their actions influence the others involved in the community. So they're growing up in a setting where they feel responsible not just for themselves, but for the community within which they are developing.
So we hope that you enjoyed that short video. We're going to continue the conversation for the second hour. I'd like to actually talk about something that we touched on during the first hour. I want to talk a little bit about social justice. I want to talk about the human condition. I want to talk about, just small topics like that. I want to talk about what it means to be open and how we as learners and those that are creating learning environments can facilitate sort of fair and rounded conversations. For Miro and I, we don't come back to the United States that often. And when we do, it always strikes us how this country in particular has such a divisive flavor, either us or them or black or white or left or right. And it seems to me that there's a shutdown of the learning. Like, we're not listening to one another anymore. How do we get to this point, and what can we do as facilitators, not just from a political perspective, but from a perspective of connecting with all of humanity
On a personal level.
on a personal level? What are some of the things that we can do to be accountable and responsible for moving and pushing through that kind of divisiveness? And of course, I'm opening this up to the panel. It's just a small little question.
I don't mind starting off. I'm sure everyone has a lot of things to say about this, given the times that we're living in the U.S. for sure, and around the world, honestly. Like, so many countries are dealing with similar struggles and conversations around social justice. And really, the idea of even being able to see and make visible all of the different people who live and breathe and share the same space and air, and who aren't being treated with dignity and respect all the time. And so I think, in a way, what we talked about in the first half, to me, is super applicable to this conversation, because the way injustice survives in so many ways is by invisibilizing and dehumanizing people. And that's not unrelated to what happens in schools often for people. And then the counter possibility of, like, humanizing, visibilizing, respecting, connecting with dignity with people. And so learners, co-learners, I think about co-learners, both those helping to facilitate such environments as well as those in them, and all of us as co-learners. In my work, we use the word facilitant, which is facilitator, participant. We're like both all the time. But that so much of it is about listening. So much of it is about showing up and being willing to sit and be in hard conversations and not escape them and leave them, but just be present there and listen through the grief and listen through their anger and listen through the rage and the pain, and to not pick it up and take it on and then make it all about me, but no, to like be there with it and let it flow through, and create spaces that actually can allow for that kind of listening and therefore the healing that comes through that witnessing, through that ability to be with people, be with myself, be with all of those who have suffered in different ways in these systems, and then the trust that actually through the being with, through that, and the relationships that also are built, and the honesty that's shared, that then the creativity also comes through, that there's this possibility of generating other kinds of systems, other ways of beings, other ways of relationship that are the world we want to see, and that we can move through that together, that not by ignoring what has been or what is, rather by sitting and being with it and moving with it together, and then allowing for the creativity on the other side. So for me, it's all interconnected, what we've been talking about. And the kinds of environments that really support that are the ones we've been sharing about, I think, around vulnerability and presence and listening and openness and authenticity and accountability and curiosity, all of the different things people have been naming. So yeah, just to start us off.
I definitely agree. The first half of our show definitely tackled the kind of overarching theme that would be necessary for us to really kind of peel back the layers, if you will, of social justice, racial justice that's happening. And it's rampant, unfortunately, everywhere. And for me here in Philadelphia, this year, I'm having my second homeschool conference later in October, and I'm actually calling out the elephant in the room, because I noticed that within the home education community, there is a great deal of exclusion that is happening with learning centers, with families, everyone just kind of, it's very in-group based or clique based, if you will. And it's so hard for people to get outside of that, kind of break that mold and say, if I look at the history of US-based homeschooling, then yes, it makes sense, because it's very much been a predominantly white and like fundamental Christian-based idea. And for it to come to the forefront now with so many people who are questioning education across the board, regardless of color, race, gender, whatever, everyone is questioning the system, as it were. So more people are saying, look, I want an alternative. I want another way. But this shift is not something that we all got together and created a memo and said, this is going to happen. So there's people who are interrupted in a way from what they're used to. Their in-groups are being interrupted. Their time is being interrupted. This idea of holding space for a different culture of people, from a completely different ideology of what learning is. And so many of us, if not all, are coming in with so much transgenerational trauma that's connected to learning. The idea of even working with our own children is a struggle, let alone to be the facilitant for other people. So for me, this conference that I'm having is really for all parents and spaces or representatives of spaces to really come together and talk about it, because that's something that many of us do not want to do because it's so taboo. No one wants to use the Black word or the white word or whatever the word of the day is. That's, it's doing something on Twitter or whatever, but no one wants to talk about it. And I think for me, that's the beginning step, is to talk about it, to acknowledge that there is a discomfort, to acknowledge that, this isn't okay. And if we're going to have these spaces, that there should be leadership that is representative of the collective of people who are engaging in this type of learning across the board. And if we can't talk about it, I'm not really sure what we can actually do about it, because we can't read each other's minds. So for me, the first thing, if we're dealing with lack of inclusion, social justice, racial justice, even food justice, I mean, for me, I volunteer time at an urban farm, so it's still the same issues that are coming up, and we're still having this extreme level of segregating ourselves. But I think the biggest thing that we can do is just kind of sit down with one another and begin to understand. Go back to the first half of the show when we talk about openness, where we speak about being able to be in a space. You are the learner and the learned, if you will, and go back to the drawing board and figure it out and create that opportunity to learn something more than what you've been used to learning.
I'm glad Malika mentioned talking and dialogue, because I think specifically when that conversation happens, whether it's between, small groups, specific people, it's a larger social conversation. The first thing that's most important is the ability to listen, and actually listening and receiving and letting that integrate into your own thoughts. Then also, because dialogue and conversation is about hearing and then responding, it also takes some authenticity. So you really have to be willing to be vulnerable and risk, all kinds of negative feelings that might come about. But that's where the growth happens. I think after that, you then have to understand that whoever you're talking to, whatever the groups or the people are, they have and have had a different experience than you. What they've perceived and understood and taken in and learned about the world is going to be different than yours. And depending on that person and their demographic, it could be vastly different. So different that it's beyond your imagination or what you could conceive on your own. So acknowledge that there are different experiences, and then also understand when you're coming into a conversation that you could be wrong. Be willing to be corrected or criticized or have the holes in what you're saying pointed out, because it's in order for edification to happen, in order for improvement to happen, we have to see the flaws and the chinks in the armor and be able to address them. So again, you have to be able to listen. You have to be able to be authentic. You have to acknowledge that there are different experiences. You have to be able to be wrong and know that that's okay. And lastly, you have to also acknowledge that not only are you going to be wrong sometimes, but you might have done something really bad. You might have done something really fucked up and harmed somebody in some way. And that's a part of life. We're all humans. We're going to mess up. We're going to be wrong. We're going to have trouble pushing past our emotions. But in order for that conversation to happen, in order for it to be beneficial, you really have to bring your whole self and see and not just come to talk and not just come to convince, but also come to hear and be convinced and to be, crafted and corrected.
So I don't want to make this an American-centric conversation, because Luke, you are also on the panel and you are in Australia, but there are similar issues around the world. And one of the ways that we tackle these conversations is we work with teens around the world, and we talk about worldviews. We explore the concept of worldviews, and each person has their own filter that they see the world through. But specifically in the U.S., we're never taught that there are other ways of seeing things. And that is probably the first most detrimental problems that we face. We think that our perspective as a U.S. citizen tends to be the most important. And that learning that there are other ways of seeing the world through other perspectives and other eyes would, to me, be the first step in creating more compassion, and allows us to be able to hear one another. I'd love to open it up to the panel and ask you, what are some of the other ways that we can help support more tolerance and create more compassion with our learning?
For me, it's all about pushing the envelope You've got to push the envelope, and just like Anthony was saying before, it really is a whole bunch more of the same. For me, I work with private schools and public schools here in Philadelphia on race and inclusion throughout the year, because for me, I'm advocating for all young people. I don't really care where you go because at some point we're all gonna converge and meet each other. So I'm working with young people and parents from all different backgrounds. And the biggest thing for me is everyone wants to have everyone wants that perfect tool, that perfect solution, that when they come out of this workshop, everything's just going to be like, yeah, I don't have that problem anymore. I'm free of that problem. Well, that's a huge wrong. That's a huge wrong. And it still goes back to the beginning of our conversation about building relationships. And I'm working with these schools, and I'm working with them for a year, and we're continuing our work for possibly another 2 years. And some people are not okay with that, but it's that dialogue that we're having to have. It's people not recognizing how deep their bias is in a number of ways, not race, gender, age, and the times are changing. When I'm thinking about the idea of non-binary, was not something that existed really strongly when I was a younger person. And now, yeah, younger, I'm going for that today. But everything now is completely different, and our young people are looking at the world with a larger scope than I think any generation has previous. We have access to information that wasn't there before. And for me, it's all about any facilitation that I will do. The biggest thing that I will say is do something that you haven't done before. Just give it a shot. Whether it's attending a festival, I will go to every festival. I don't care. Well, within reason, right? My safety is important, but I will go to every cultural festival there is so that I can understand the people who surround me. Volunteer your time someplace. Find an organization that your thoughts align with their mission. Volunteer your time. Make a friend, go to local coffee shop and just sit down, have a cup of tea with someone that, not without being completely intrusive, of course, but these are things that you can do. And they're small moments, and it's about working from the inside out, in my opinion. And the top down clearly isn't working. But if we're working from the inside out and really addressing the brokenness within ourselves as individuals, and then be able to go out into the community, whether your community is the people in your home, and then the people on your block, and then the people in your zip code or local area, and just keep building that. I like to think of it as a pebble in the water. It's going to make a ripple, right? And if we all throw out a pebble, we're all going to connect in some way in some time. It's just that waiting game of when, and patience is required when that happens, because you're not just asking people to just take this class or indulge in this workshop. You're asking to change a heart of a human being. And that takes a lifetime. So I would just say dare to be different, dare to do something that you haven't done before.
Yeah, and it really is just about trying. It's about putting the effort in. And I would completely agree with what Malika said. And I think that immersion and exposure to just different experiences is one of the best ways that we can kind of try to cross the perceived cultural barriers or the cultural gaps. And I think that, it's kind of like what we all talked about just previously, that in order to even try to address these problems, we first have to have the conversation. We first have to have the experience, because that's where everything would naturally have to start. And how can we pass judgments, and how can we try and say something about another group of people or another person if we don't really understand them, if we don't know them, if there's just a complete lack of understanding and there's this complete separation? We can't. And originally the question was, how can we promote more tolerance in this conversation about education and also just in general. But I think the conversation, or the question rather, really should be rephrased, and it should be, how can we promote more acceptance and celebration even of differing ways and of differing perspectives. And I think that immersion is the single best way that you can do that. Just going out there, putting yourself in that experience, having that conversation, talking to people, trying. And, obviously sometimes it's not going to be very pretty, because there is a level of accountability to that a lot of people aren't accustomed to. You could put yourself in a situation and you could be criticized, and, like we all said earlier, that's a part of it. That's how you learn. That's you get over that, and, you learn from your mistakes. But the first part of learning from your mistakes is accepting your mistakes and acknowledging the fact that you have made mistakes. And I really think I really like what you said, Malika. And I will say, it's just about trying. It's about effort, and it's about acceptance of yourself and others. So.
Just to add a little more to that, I think just continuing to bring it full circle, like, there are environments that support that to happen in a better way, in a way that actually does lead to meaningful dialogue and meaningful relationships. One of the things I've been really reflecting on a lot in my life is that I would rather be in relationship than be right. And that is something that I think when I enter a space in my space of vulnerability and stretch and willingness to listen and learn, I'm saying I'm willing to be in relationship. I would rather be in relationship than have my ideas or my analysis or anything intact in this way that is immovable. And I think that, at least when I look at the bigger, political situation, as well as, where like, at least the story that we get told, because I don't always think that's always the whole story. That's a fraction of the story that's being told. But whatever it is, often it's about being right and not being in relationship. And I'm really trying to reverse that in myself and in the work that I do with people, is like, what does it mean to really look and seek out relationships, and to seek out friendships, and friendships as the engine of social change and social transformation? That a lot of things move in the world, and they move through that care and through that relationship. And it's a way of like, I like what Malika, you shared about, changing hearts. For me, it's actually reconnecting to the heart. Like, the heart is often very lost. It's a lot of like just head and abstraction and generalizations and categorizations, and trying to meet people from the mind, which isn't where people exist. And people are whole people. People are in their hearts. People are in their souls, and people are in their bodies. And to see them as whole, and to be myself in wholeness, is going to be something that's going to shift that. And so to get back to the heart of myself and the heart with others is like a really big part of creating the kind of spaces. And so that good takes us back into like learning environments. Like, what are the learning? Are our learning environments nurturing people's hearts? Are our learning environments helping people be whole and be seen as whole? Are our learning environments supportive to listening and supportive to authentic relationship? What is happening in our learning environments? And again, those are for me like amazing entry points. Like, okay, if those are what we need to actually get to a world where people are treated with respect and dignity, and where we have systems that are actually honoring and celebrating, as you said, Miro, like celebrating people, then we have really good places to start of like, okay, what do we do in our learning environments to make sure they are centered in our hearts and in our listening and in our love, fundamentally. So I think it's beautiful tying it together.
So if I could sum up a little bit, it sounds as if we're discussing learning for social change, right? I mean, we're all envisioning something different. I want to ask the 4 teens that are on the panel how that feels to you. It's transformative, but is that something that you feel is something you're capable of doing? Are you capable of being on the leading edge of this movement for social change? Is that something that you're comfortable acknowledging? Is that something that feels good to you? Is that something that you want to take on as young learning activists?
Definitely. I think it's a feat for anybody to take on an activist role, but when I first came back to the States after traveling through the South Pacific, and obviously the culture and the island chain of Vanuatu is going to be much different than California, but I was very disappointed in my age group of in college there. Everybody was judgmental. There was so much negativity. I didn't meet any friends. Not that anybody was particularly mean, but everybody was very self-centered, and I disagreed with every part of it. I started with being kind to others, and whether that backfired or not, I felt good about myself, and I felt good about taking that stance. And I supported the differences, and I encouraged others to do the same. And I think one by one, we can definitely make a change, especially in the younger generations where it's obviously becoming more and more of an issue. And I think it's definitely we should all work together on. And like I said, one by one, we can definitely make it happen.
I'm sorry, my internet cut out, so I didn't hear all of what you just said, Cassidy. But relating to the discussion earlier, certainly all of the things that you were talking about that are very present in the US certainly exist here, and I think exist in almost all places around the world. And again, the capacity to be in dialogue and sort of listen, and also stay in your body when you listen, because like you said, I think Shilpa, a lot of the discussion just stays in the mind, and we don't engage with compassion. We don't connect to people on a heart level. So yeah, I think creating a space where our ideas can clash but not our hearts is really important for that. And then Lainey, regarding your question about being sort of at the forefront of that movement, yeah, I think if you acknowledge that there is a movement, you don't really have a choice. Or it's very difficult to say then that you aren't going to be a part of it, because while it's sort of scary and confronting, it's sort of like once you come out of your shell, you can't put the shell back together and hide back inside. You sort of realize that I can't really go along with something that I see creating so many problems. And yeah, I'm not sure what Cassidy or Dylan said earlier. My internet cut out, but yeah, it is not always a comfortable space, and I think one of the main sort of blocks I deal with is worrying about sort of damaging my social connection to my peers in my age group, and whether there'll be understanding or like any recognition of that working for social change or sort of paradigm shift is in any way, if that's relevant or makes any sense. But I think I also worry too much. I think there would be readiness and openness more than I think there would be. Yeah, I think I worry a little too much about that. So yeah.
I definitely agree with what Luke said about, and I was going to say also, I feel like, yeah, it's really like there isn't much of a choice, because the truth of the matter is, as young adults in this world, I think that we don't even have to intellectualize and say that, oh, we're activists at the forefront of this movement. Really, what it all comes down to is, if we live our lives and we navigate our interactions with integrity, and we stand up for what we believe in, we speak our opinions, that's really what it comes down to. And the rest will follow. Just navigating our lives with integrity, we can't help but be a part of this movement. And that's really just what it comes down to, I would say.
Let me ask this panel that are working with younger children, what is the message that you want to embark? Nah, that's not even the right question. I guess what I'm asking is, in what manner can you facilitate kids finding their own voice? What does that look like? What does that look like for you working with younger kids? And how do you deal with social challenges of injustices when speaking to younger children?
I was hesitating because I don't work so much with younger children, though I get to interact with younger children through friends and their children. And so I'm sure more people have more insights into this. And the thing that comes to me is like younger children are also people, and they're here in this world, and they are seeing and seeing things. And I can remember myself as a young child seeing injustices and seeing things that didn't feel good, and just how my own family supported me in that of listening to me and acknowledging what I saw was real and not a pretend thing, and saying this is not okay and this is something that happens, and you know, part of what we're trying to do in our lives is change this and make it different, and allowing me to also have space for my sadness. Often it showed up as sadness, and later on as I got older, more like anger, and so allowing space for that and actually listening to that and saying, yeah, that's true, and those feelings and those emotions are real, and they're valid, and I'm here for you, and I'm here to support. And in a way, I think with younger kids, they're so in tune, you know, and so I find so much more quickly in tune to connection and to seeking connection and to understanding how important relationship and connection is. And so there's a way that they pick up on it so much quicker in my experience, and they don't have a bunch of story around it. It's like actually pretty simple. And so acknowledging that the things aren't right or aren't in alignment is really important, and that there is a scope to change it, and that they can be part of that through their actions and through their being, which is pretty natural. I find mostly comes pretty naturally to most little kids. So yeah, for me, it's a lot about just listening, and it's listening and loving and recognizing and trying to offer that there are ways that they can move forward. Yeah.
I guess I can chime in a bit. The young people that I work with I work with young people as young as a little over a year, and I love my young people because they are hands down the most honest individuals I will ever come across. And I think as a mom, when my children say, but mom, but why? But why? I've grown to appreciate that from a young person when dealing with an injustice. But why? Why is this not okay for this person sheerly because they look different or they think differently or whatever the case may be? There's a natural tendency for young people to question why. And I think that's something over time that sometimes us older folks tend to get rid of. Sometimes we just kind of take it for granted that what we've been told is the truth. And we just kind of go with it. But whether it's reading stories that reflect different in-groups, in having those really hard conversations, even with young people, it's highly possible and it's highly recommended. I see most of the trauma that I see that happens with our young people happens at the playground, hands down. That is the space where a lot of our young people are free from parents. They are free to try and exhibit things that they've heard, that they've seen, and they try them. And I've seen some really unfortunate circumstances come about right at the playground. And for me, that becomes the perfect opportunity to address that situation, whether I'm able to address it with the young person individually or with their parent, or something that I can address with my children in that moment and not let it go by. But I think one of the biggest things that any of us can do in supporting our young people is not to just kind of put them in a hole to say, well, they're young and they'll figure it out, or they're just kids and it's okay. It's not okay, because that one thing that you see as innocent will grow and manifest into something really intentional and down the line very hurtful if you do not address it in that moment. And it doesn't have to be, you don't have to break out all the SAT words. You don't have to do the macro aggression. Our young people don't understand those words. They really don't. But what they do understand is that hurts. I'm not comfortable with that. I like that. That's pretty, very, very small, and break it down to its smallest of value, but in a way that they can understand. And as they grow older, then you can introduce new language. But I think at the end of the day, no matter who it is, no matter what age they are, if they are experiencing injustice, I don't need elitist language to describe how I'm feeling. It hurts, period. So if we can start having those conversations with our young people early and kind of try and get away from this idea that we want to protect our children from the cruel injustices of the world, as much as I get that, what I think is cruel is hiding the fact that they're not living in a reality that is true.
I really wanted to chew on that for a bit, and now I'm thinking, I kind of have an idea, but I don't want to say this for sure, but I'm thinking, what if, or maybe young people or all people are born with their voice or having a voice, as you asked. I mean, when you deal with a young child, a toddler, or an infant, their voice is, the loudest one in the room in a sense. Everybody is super concerned with what they have to say, in some sense. And I'm just wondering, what if, as we grow up, life kind of tells us or feeds us like information about how to use our voice. So maybe you learn that my voice doesn't matter, or my voice does matter. And so you learn that people are going to listen to me, or people are not going to listen to me, or I'm going to be validated, or I'm going to be invalidated. So I'm thinking about that for the voice thing, as far as how to, introduce these conversations or subjects. Like Malika said, I mean, kids, all people, but we definitely, like, young people understand feeling hurt for sure. And they definitely understand, like, us have a sense of what's fair, not fair. And I think that's a basic kind of experience that's just in us, even at a young age. And so I think that's a great place to use as a platform to talk about all things. And then also, like she said, I'm not a huge fan of keeping a nice sort of like rainbow, unicorn, fairy, grass is green bubble. Because just imagine, if you're always maintaining that because you want to protect the emotions of your kid. I mean, it really underestimates their ability to hold within them that life is sometimes good and sometimes bad. Like, there's this balance. And, imagine, they're kept in this bubble or this world, and you're trying to keep the darkness or the dismay of the world from them. It's going to happen at some point. So imagine it. Either they grow up and not believing the experiences of different and other people who are more faced with these instances of injustice, which causes even more problems. That's what we deal with now. Or they're just like really smacked in the face with it when they have to deal with it. And that can be traumatizing, I imagine. So for me, it's much better to figure out and stumble in talking about these things with young people. And you don't have to go in so heavy. We introduce these concepts to the kids all the time, and it's not about the world is bad, there's gloom and doom, and this is just what it is. I think it's empowering that we also move to action and what can we do about it and how to remedy this, or how can we change that situation in our own learning environment. So I think it's doable, and I think there are ways. And it's I don't have a book. I haven't written the book yet of how to have these conversations with young people, but it can be done. And it's just about figuring it out and being willing to be wrong, to make a mishap. Yeah.
Thank you. I do, we've only got like 15 more minutes left of our conversation, and I want to make sure that we each have time to share a closing thought. And I'm going to ask that everybody shares a closing thought on any of the aspects that we've been talking about today in terms of creating learning environments, or what that means, or how to redefine it, or whatever it is. Impart your closing thought with us. And then when you're finished with that, please do share your projects and websites. And I will remind our audience to go to the show notes page for the links. But if you're working on a book, or if you're working on a project, please do take a couple moments to share what you're working on now. So I'm going to open this up to the panel, closing thoughts and projects and websites. And who would like to jump in first? 2 hours in, you're not shy. I know nobody's shy.
Closing thoughts. Creating learning environments. This is a rare opportunity that we have to build your own art, if you will. Create your own space and let that space, it doesn't have to be physical space. It can be internal space, but create that space for you and what it means to you. So much of what we do is based on a how-to book or some kind of Wikipedia source, and it really doesn't have to be that way. This is the perfect opportunity if you want to create a learning environment to go beyond that, to start fresh. And sometimes that's really scary, but it's also really invigorating and empowering to be able to define a space in your likeness, in a space that is open for anyone to be able to step into and learn something from that if they wish. So I think for me, that's kind of my closing. As far as upcoming projects, I have one major project, which is the second annual homeschool conference and Explorers Day Camp. It's going to be here in Philadelphia on Monday, October 15th at the Academy of Natural Sciences of Drexel University. And our theme this year, which is pretty relevant to this talk, which is creating racial equity in home education. So it's open to everyone and anyone, and it'll be with Artwell. It'll be great, and everyone's welcome. EclecticLearningNetwork.com. Visit Facebook, Eclectic Learning Network, Instagram, Eclectic Learning Network.
Thanks, Malika. Closing thoughts. I'm feeling really, really grateful to everyone for being on this panel. Really wonderful to meet new folks and see Lainey, you again after a long time. So I'm feeling really grateful for the insights also, and the connection of all of the understanding of how learning environments and how we are as human beings and how we meet the conflicts and injustices in our world and how we build towards what we want to see in the world, how it's all interconnected and interrelated. So I'm feeling really grateful for that. And I'm also just really recognizing how much power each person, each being actually has in this conversation. It's just illuminating that to me again, that each person has so much power in how I show up in the place, how a person shows up, how I decide to interact with the people I'm meeting, what I'm both bringing forward in my curiosity and my openness and my love, and what I'm also offering in my support and listening, and how I meet people. And in any micro moment, those learning environments can emerge that are super healing and connective and transformative. And so just remembering that even small moments and each of us are using our power in different ways can make a difference. So that's what I feel like is coming to me at the end of this. And in terms of upcoming events, there are a lot of YES programs coming up, a lot of jams, the Wellness and Healing Justice Jam, the North America Leadership Jam, the Toronto Jam, the Southern Leadership Jam, programs in Egypt and the Middle East, in case anyone out there is listening from there, and India and Turkey as well, and an Asian Pacific Islander Jam also, and Mexico as well. So a lot of programs coming up. You can check out our website, yesworld.org, for lots of juicy connections and invitations to be part of co-creating these kinds of learning environments that can transform and heal ourselves and each other and our world. Thanks.
My closing thoughts are just appreciation. I'm so glad that as we're talking about education to young people, we also have young people or younger people on the panel. I think that can often be an oversight or a miss when we have these kinds of conversations. We're supposed to be learner or young people centric, and sometimes we don't necessarily involve their voice. So I'm so glad and appreciative of you all's presence. And I think, the biggest point for me, I'm glad we got to the conversation of how to have these conversations about in social justice and injustice and equity with young children, as young as 5, because that's often a difficult and rough conversation, especially for parents, because, as a parent, you have that concern or fear of your child's innocence going away. So I'm glad we got to talk about that. I am at Hartswood Agile Learning Center in Atlanta, Georgia. You can find us on Facebook, Instagram. You can also go to heartwoodalc.org, and you can reach out to us on any of those platforms, and we're available.
Yeah.
Take it
Hi
away.
guys, sorry about that Chinese swap out there. Our internet's kind of bad, but anyways, for conclusion for me, I think learning environments played a huge role in my life. I learned through elementary school publicly, and it didn't really fit my needs. And so I tried homeschooling, and I remember in that case too, my mom would be chasing me around with a pencil and a notebook and tell me to do my math problems, and that did not work well for us either. But when I moved onto the boat, we attempted more of an unschooling kind of environment, and that fit my life so much better. And there were maybe some things that I could have learned through my high school years that I missed, but in all honesty, I traded that for one more year of general education in college, and I wouldn't have missed my traveling experiences for any of that. So, I believe that our learning environment is different for everybody, and it was a painstaking process for me to find my perfect match, but it's been a great journey along the way.
You good?
Go for it.
Yeah, I think one of the biggest themes of the show has been being open. And I think growing up on the road, my learning environment changed so much that being open was probably the biggest factor into, taking in the information from all the different types of cultures and people and races that we met. I think really just being open is probably the biggest takeaway.
It was a pleasure meeting everybody, and thank you all for the experience of joining for the talk.
Yeah, I'd also just like to say thanks. Last time I was on the show, I really enjoyed the conversation as well. And this time's been really great. I think the thing that stood out to me was thinking of learning environments in the context of the broader global environment. And this came up in the last conversation I was involved in too, but the fact that, you can learn any skill in the world if it's in the context of what's going on of societal transformation, and if you're aware of the polarization and destruction that's going on our planet, in that context, it doesn't really matter what you learn because all those skills are applicable to that context. And the other thing that was mentioned a little bit, but I thought could be stressed a bit more, was with young children and with all learning environments, making space for emotions as well as thinking is really important, because when you make space for emotions and difficult emotions, then you can process them and sort of acknowledge their influence. But if you don't acknowledge them, then you'll be unconscious of the effects that they're having, and then they also impact the way you're able to think and be in dialogue. So to be able to have listening spaces where emotions are okay in learning, I think that's a really important part of learning as well. Yeah. Thank you, everyone. I've really enjoyed listening and being on here again.
Sure. I guess I would just say that, like I mentioned maybe a few times, that I think that immersion, whether that's in a cultural sense or whether that's in, a language sense, or really any kind of immersion, I think it's the best way to learn, and that's really all about learning environments. Just having exposure and having experience and having the freedom to make your own decisions within those circumstances and within those situations, I think is really just the strongest way that people can learn. And your environment is definitely very important. And that's not just to do with your physical environment, it's to do with the people you surround yourself with. It's to do with the ideas and the concepts and the conversations you surround yourself with as well. And I think everybody on this panel is doing incredible work, and I would love to commend just everybody. So, yeah.
And I just want to say thank you. Thank you. It's been a couple of months since I've had a live conversation on and hosting one of these panels. And again, as Miro said, my heart is just bursting with the inspiration from all of you. And you're passionate people, and it's an honor to be in conversation with each one of you. Thank you. Thank you so much for your time, and thank you for sharing your insight, and thank you for sharing your passion for learning environments. I'm incredibly grateful for the last 2 hours. I also want to thank Nina, who produced this show. She put together this incredible panel, diverse backgrounds and perspectives, and this is the way that we learn. Thank you, Nina. And thank you over to Mel and Biggie over at Conscious Consumer Network. Thank you for allowing us to have this platform to have these conversations. Just all around gratitude. Thank you, thank you, thank you. In closing, I just want to say, wherever you are and whatever you do, continue to always doing it for the love of learning. And that's it.
Humanity has been on an epic journey of discovery, learning the truth about the world we live in. New discoveries about the true origins of humanity, ancient history, free energy, as well as the systematic corruption of world governments are now on the forefront of our daily reality. Is the world headed towards destruction based on control and power? Or is an opportunity now being presented to shift and uplift into a higher consciousness? My name is Mel V, co-founder and creative director of Conscious Consumer Network, an independent broadcast network that was launched on the 1st of January 2015. In the last 3 years, Conscious Consumer Network has broadcast over 2,800 shows in multiple languages, featuring guests from across the world, whilst creating media that is aimed at the creation of a free, fair, peaceful, just sustainable world. Conscious Consumer Network provides full training and an interactive support network for all broadcasters, and we are always looking for inspiring and educational content.
Hi, this is Lainey Liberty.
And this is Miro Siegel.
In 2018, Conscious Consumer Network has expanded to multiple broadcast locations, increasing our availability and reach across the world, remaining on the cutting edge of independent media. If we wish to create a better world, we must first create better media geared towards real education instead of indoctrination.
You guys really are what changing the world is going to be about. It's educating kids at a grassroots level.
Having become a pillar of stability in the turbulent world of independent media, we have even more going on in 2018. Conscious Consumer Network is a publicly funded network, and we rely on all of you to keep us on the air. Show your support for independent media by donating to our 2018 Network Support Fund. Dare to seek a better world. Support independent media.